everybody, welcome back. So, to finish off our Whiserween, I'm going to be reading some of the most famous urban legend, kind of fictional horror stories from the book trilogy, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. If you are not aware, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is a collection of shorter scary stories collected by Alvin Schwartz, and there are absolutely terrifying illustrations by Stephen Gammell. So, how does this gonna work is I'm gonna read just a couple of random stories from the 3 books, and hopefully you're gonna enjoy. I'll put the drawings on the screen for a little bit, either before or after each story, depending on the context. But I hope you enjoy. Some of them are funny, some of them are terrifying, some of them are not that scary, but either way, they are intriguing, exciting, and invigorating. I'm going to start off with the original book, which, by the way, this cover is from the movie Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. This is Harold. And then the second one is the terrifying lady from the hospital. And the third one is just pure hell. If you've seen the film or read the book. But shall we get into it? I thought it would be interesting to just kind of through and see. So I have this one. He heard footsteps coming up the stairs. Okay. Oh no. I think that's the title of a section because it says, or a chapter. There are ghosts in this chapter. One comes back as a real person, one takes revenge on her murder, and there are other strange happenings. Great. The first one on the next page is called The Thing. The drawing, the illustration is terrifying. It is at the start of the story, so I will put it up now to show you guys. While I begin to read this story. Okay. Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near a post office, talking about one thing and another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Suddenly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark it was hard to tell for sure. Then it was gone. But it soon appeared again. It walked halfway across the road. Then it turned around and went back to the field. Then it came out a third time and started towards them. By now Ted and Sam were scared. They started to run. But when they finally stopped, they decided they were being foolish. They weren't sure what had scared them, so they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon they saw it. For it was coming to meet them. It was wearing black pants, a white shirt, and black suspenders. Sam said, "I'm gonna try and touch it, then we'll know if it's real." He walked up to it and peered into its face. It had bright, penetrating eyes sunk deep into its head. It looked like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed. And again, he and Sam ran. But this time, the skeleton followed them. When they got to Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it. It stayed out on the road for a while. Then it disappeared. A year later, Ted got sick and died. Toward the end, Sam stayed up with him every night. The night Ted died, Sam said he looked just like the skeleton. And that's it. And that's it. So, I thought I'd talk like a small bit about each one, but I find that story really strange because it seems like there's a really good build-up, and then the last paragraph is like, a year later he died and he looked like the ghost or the skeleton. And then they just kind of be like, okay, that's it, bye-bye. So anyway, the illustration is definitely the most terrifying thing of this. But yeah, it's a good one. I like it. I like it. Okay, shall we move on? Should we move on to, let's see. Okay, is this a longer one? The Wendigo. Okay. Are you ready? This is called The Wendigo. A wealthy man wanted to go hunting in a part of northern Canada where few people had ever hunted. He traveled to a trading post and tried to find a guide to take him, but no one would do it. It was too dangerous, they said. Finally, he found an Indian who needed money badly, and he agreed to take him. The Indian's name was Defago. They made it up the camp, in the snow near a large frozen lake. For 3 days they hunted, but they had nothing to show for it. The third night, a windstorm came up. They lay in their tent, listening to the wind howling and their trees whispering back and forth. To see the storm better, the hunter opened the tent flap. What he saw startled him. There wasn't a breath of air stirring, and the trees were standing perfectly still. Yet he could hear the wind howling, and the more he listened, the more it sounded like they were calling Defago's name. Defago! It called. Defago! I must be losing my mind, the hunter thought. But Defago had gotten out of his sleeping bag. He was huddled in a corner of the tent, his head buried in his arms. What is this all about? The hunter asked. It's nothing, Defago said. But the wind continued to call him, and Defago became more tense and more restless. Defago, it called. Defago. Suddenly, he jumped to his feet and began to run from the tent, but the hunter grabbed him and wrestled him to the ground. You can't leave me out here, the hunter shouted, as the wind called again and Defago broke loose and ran into the darkness. The hunter could hear him screaming as he went. Again and again he cried, "Oh, my fiery feet, my burning feet of fire." Then his voice faded away, and the wind died down. At daybreak, the hunter followed Defago's tracks in the snow. They went through the woods, down to the lake, and out onto the ice. But soon he noticed something strange. The steps Defago had taken got longer and longer. They were so long, no human being could ever have taken them. It was as if something had helped him to hurry away. The hunter followed the tracks out to the middle of the lake, but there they disappeared. At first he thought that Defago had fallen through the ice, but there wasn't any hole. Then he thought that something had pulled him up into the sky, but that had made no sense. As he stood wondering what happened, the wind picked up again. Soon it was howling as the night before. Then he heard Defago's voice. It was coming from above. And again he heard Defago screaming, "My fiery feet, my burning feet." But there was nothing to be seen. Now the hunter wanted to leave that place as fast as he could. He went back to camp and packed. Then he left some food for Defago and he started out. Weeks later he reached civilization. The following year he went back to hunt in that area again. He went to the same trading post to look for the guide. The people there could not explain what had happened to Defago that night, but they had not seen him since then. Maybe it was the Wendigo, one of them said, and laughed. It's supposed to come out with the wind. It drags you along at great speed until your feet are burned away, and more of you than that. Then it carries you into the sky and it drops you. It's just a crazy story, but that's what some of the Indians say. A few days later, the hunter was at the trading post again. An Indian came by and sat by the fire. He had a blanket wrapped around him, and he wore his hat so that you couldn't see his face. The hunter thought there was something familiar about him. He walked over and asked, "Are you Devago?" The Indian didn't answer. "Do you know anything about him?" No answer. He began to wonder if something was wrong, if the man needed help, but he couldn't see his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. No answer. To get a look at him, he lifted the Indian's hat. Then he screamed. There was nothing under the hat but a pile of ashes. Okay, that one was hard because Indian, no, not really. No, I don't think we needed to say Indian. So I'm almost sure that, well, these books are in the 80s. They were written in the 80s or 90s, I think 80s. So back then they weren't really good people, I think. I think everyone was really horrible and didn't know any better, so we have to give them that pass. But we have learned and we have grown. Good for us as a society. Overall, good story. I liked it a lot. Big fan. Apart from the, anyway, so I've just gone back to one of my favorites, which is called The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. Let me see. This one is pretty short, and also the picture in that one was after the first page, so I just put it in a little bit halfway through, but this one is at the very end, so I will pop the picture in afterwards. It's quite short. Okay, this is called The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. Some boys and girls were at a party once. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. "Don't ever stand on a grave after dark," one of the boys said. "The person inside will grab you. He'll pull you under." "That's not true," one of the girls said. "It's just superstition." "I'll give you $1 if you stand on the grave," said the boy. "A grave doesn't scare me," said the girl. "I'll do it right now." The boy handed her his knife. "Stick this knife in one of the graves," he said. "Then we'll know you were there." The graveyard was filled with shadows and was quiet as death. There was nothing to be scared of, the little girl told herself, but she was scared anyway. She picked at a grave and stood on it. Then quickly she bent over and plunged the knife into the soil and started to leave. But she couldn't get away. Something was holding her back. She tried a second time to leave, but she couldn't move. She was filled with terror. "Something has got me," she screamed, and she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt and had pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that had held her. She had died of fright. Wow, I like that one because it's not like true ghosts, it's just heterosexual people being influenced by each other. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, the drawing for that one is scary. It's not actual ghosts. It's pretty great. I'm just skipping through to see if I can find one more short one. Okay, I'm gonna do one more short one from this, and then we'll pick out a couple from number 2 and number 3. This one is called "What Do You Come For?" There was an old woman who lived all by herself, and she was very lonely. Sitting in the kitchen one night, she said, "Oh, I wish I had some company." No sooner had she spoken than down the chimney tumbled 2 feet from which the flesh had rotted. The old woman's eyes bulged with terror. Then the 2 legs dropped into the hearth and attached themselves to the feet. Then the body tumbled down, then 2 arms and a man's head. As the old woman watched, the parts came together into a great gangling man. The man danced around the room. Faster and faster he went, then he stopped and looked at she asked in a small voice, and that shivered and shook. "What do I come for?" he said. "I come for you." And then it gives you an instruction to say, as you shout the last words, stamp your foot and jump at someone nearby. But this is an ASMR video, so we won't be doing that. However, I like that one too. Short, easy, scary, simple, great. Thank you. First book. Tucked away. Let's move on to the second book, and we'll pick a couple of stories from there. Alright, I've just flicked through, and I think I'm going to go with one called Hello Kate. So any Kates watching, shout out to you. Here we go. Tom Connors was on his way to the dance in the next village. It was a long walk through fields and woods, but it was a soft, sweet evening that he loved dancing. So Tom didn't mind. He had gone only a short distance when he noticed a young woman following him. Maybe she's going to the dance, he thought, and he stopped and waited for her. As the woman got closer, he saw that it was Kate Faherty. They danced together many times. He was about to call, "Hello, Kate," when he suddenly remembered that Kate was dead. She had died last year, yet there she was, all dressed up for the dance. Tom wanted to run, but somehow it didn't seem right to run from Kate. He turned and started to walk away as fast as he could, but Kate followed him. He took a shortcut across the field, but she still followed. When he got to the dance hall, she was right behind him. There were a lot of people standing outside, and Tom tried to lose Kate in the crowd. He worked his way to the side of the building, then squeezed up against the wall behind some people. But Kate followed. She came so close she brushed up against him. Then he stopped and waited. He wanted to say, "Hello, Kate," just the way he did when she was alive. But he was so frightened he couldn't speak. Her eyes looked into his, and she vanished. Okay, I just realized I'm reading the third one, but Halloween is spooky, so sometimes you get surprises like skipping the second book for a minute. That is a strange but interesting story. Again, the conclusion was just like, she's gone now. Okay, moving on. Great stuff. I've just stumbled upon Harold. Harold is the one on the cover of the first book, and it is probably one of the most famous stories from the book, so I have to read that one. Okay, Harold, and it is a little bit longer, I think. Yeah. It's a little bit longer, so buckle in. Harold. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows up to a cool green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed up there with the cows for 2 months. Then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, was it boring. All day the two men tended to their cows. At night, back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. "Let's make a doll the size of a man," he said. "It will be fun to make, and we could just put it in the garden to scare away the birds." "It should look like Harold," Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks and stuffed it with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's and tiny eyes like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Oh, of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole out in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night they brought him inside so he wouldn't get ruined when it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick or punch him. Sometimes one would even take the food they were eating, which they were about sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you'd better eat it, or else." Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," said Thomas, "and that will be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in the corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now the doll grunted, that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insect had gotten inside Harold and were making those noises. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. One night, Alfred noticed something had frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imagination," Alfred replied. "We have been up on this mountain too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on its hind legs. All day and all night long he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt it as though they had escaped a grave danger and began joking and singing. But when they had only gone 1 mile or 2, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking stools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the stools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told one another. "After all, what could it all do?" They drew straws to see which one would go back. It was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked down towards the valley. When Alfred came up to rise to the path, he looked back for Thomas. He did not see him anywhere. But he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out bloody skin to dry in the sun. Well, Harold, you scary, scary boy. The minute that doll grunted, "Burn it, move out, go, get out, everyone run, it's time to leave." No way am I staying around Harold when he's like that. I would never, absolutely not. Not even a chance. Never, never, never. Okay. Anyway, I like that one a lot. Good story, great ending. That one to me is one of the scariest. Anyway, let's begin with the dream. And by begin, we're quite far into the video now, so by begin, I mean let's begin the dream. There's one that I really want to list or read, but I'm not sure where it is, so I'll have to find that one and make sure I can read it. But for now, let's read the dream. Lucy Morgan was an artist. She had spent a week painting a small country town and decided that the next day she would move on. She would go to a village called Kingston. But that night, Lucy Morgan had a strange dream. She dreamed that she was walking up dark, carved staircase into the bedroom. It was an ordinary room, except for two things. The carpet was made up of large squares that looked like trapdoors, and each of the windows was fastened shut with big nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lucy Morgan went to sleep in the bedroom. During the night, a woman with a pale face and black eyes and a long black hair came into the room. She leaned over to the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Flee while you can." When the woman touched her arm to hurry her along, Lucy Morgan awakened from her dream with a shriek. She lay awake the rest of the night, trembling. In the morning, she told her landlady that she had dreamed not to go to Kingston at all. "I can't tell you why," she said, "but I just can't bring myself to go there." "Then why don't you go to Dorset?" the landlady said. "It's a pretty town, and it isn't too far." So, Lucy Morgan went to Dorset. Someone told her she could find a room in a house at the top of the hill. It was a pleasant-looking house, and the landlady there, a plump, motherly woman, was nice as could be. "Let's look at the room," she said. "I think you will like it." They walked up the dark, carved staircase, like the one in Lucy's dream. In these old houses, the staircases are the same, Lucy thought. But when the landlady opened the door to the bedroom, it was the room in her dream, with the same carpet that looked like trapdoors, and the same windows with big nails. "This is just a coincidence," Lucy told herself. "How do you like it?" the landlady said. "I'm not sure," Lucy said. "Well, take your time," the landlady said. "I'll bring you up some tea when you think about it." Lucy sat on the bed, staring at the trapdoors and the big nails. Soon there was a knock on the door. "It's the landlady with tea," she thought. But it wasn't the landlady. It was the woman with the pale face and the black eyes and the long black hair. Lucy Morgan grabbed her things and fled. That one has the most terrifying drawing to me. Overall, the worst. It is so scary. And in the movie, it is terrifying as well. So, that one I give an overall. I'm going to leave out of 10. Lucy Morgan did a good job with just getting the heck out of there. So, praise to you, Lucy. I'm going to have a quick look. I'm just going to, cut to when I find the one I'm looking for, which is... Anyway, I will cut it really quick, and I'll come back and when I find that one. Found it. It is in the first book, and it is called High Beams. The reason I wanted to read this one is because it is the one that introduced me to the books, where, in an inadvertent way, because I'd heard the story a lot, just not reading the books or knowing about them, but I'd heard the story, and so that's why I want to read this one, because it has a previous, you don't need to know, nobody cares. Let's read High Beams, and then we'll finally move on to the last, which is meant to be the third book, but we're going to read the second book. I hope you're enjoying this so far. I hope you're getting spooked and scared. I hope you're getting a little bit nostalgic if you read these as a child, or maybe you're getting introduced to them for the first time. Anyway, let's go. High Beams. The girl driving the old blue sedan was a senior in high school. She lived on a farm about 8 miles away, and they used car to drive back and forth. She had driven into town that night to see a basketball game. Now she was on her way home. As she pulled away from the school, she noticed a red pickup truck following behind her in the parking lot. A few minutes later, the truck was still behind her. "I guess we're going in the same direction," she thought. She began to watch the truck in the mirror. When she changed her speed, the driver of the truck changed his speed. When she passed a car, so did he. Then he turned on his high beams, flooding her car with light. He left them on for almost a minute. He probably she thought, but she was becoming uneasy. Usually she drove home over a back road. Not too many people went that way, but when she turned onto that road, so did the truck. I've got to get away from him, she thought, and she began to drive faster. Then he turned on his high beams again. After a minute, he turned them off. Then he turned them on and off and on and off again. She drove even faster, but the truck stayed right behind her. Then he turned on his high beams again. One more, her car was ablaze with the light. What is he doing? She wondered. What does he want? Then he turned them off again. But a minute later, he had them on again and left them on. At last, she pulled into her driveway, and the truck pulled in right behind her. She jumped from the car and ran to the house. Called the police, she screamed at her father. Out in the driveway, she could see the driver of the truck. He had a gun in his hand. When the police arrived, they started to arrest him, but she pointed at the girl's car. You don't want me, he said. You want him. Crouched behind the driver's seat, there was a man with a knife. As the driver of the truck explained it, the man slipped into the girl's car just before she left the school. He saw it happen, but there was no way he could stop it. He thought about getting the police, but he was too afraid to leave her, so he followed her car. Each time the man in the back reached up to overpower her, the driver of the truck turned on his high beams. Then the man dropped down, afraid that someone might see him. So, that was a story that was told to me as like a scary story, and it is terrifying. About a guy in your car? Hell no. But yeah, that one is just a special one to me. Also, it just started raining, so good for you guys, for who are sticking around. It's time we move on to the second book, which is our final book of the evening, which I'll again read a couple of stories from. Beginning with The Window. Margaret and her brothers, Paul and David, shared a small house on top of a hill just outside the village. It was so warm one summer's night that Margaret could not sleep. She sat up in bed in the darkness of her room, watching the moon move across the sky. Suddenly, something caught her eye. She saw two small yellow-green lights move through the woods near the graveyard at the bottom of the hill. They looked like eyes of some animal, but she could not make out what kind of creature it was. Soon the creature left the woods and moved up to the hill towards the house. For a few minutes, Margaret lost sight of it. Then she saw it coming across the lawn toward the window. It looked something like a man, and yet it didn't. Margaret was terrified. She wanted to run from her room, but the door was next to her window. She was afraid the creature would see her and break in before she could escape. When the creature turned and moved into another direction, Margaret rushed to the door, but before she could open it, it was back. Margaret found herself staring through the window at a shrunken face, like that of a mummy. Its yellow-green eyes gleamed like a cat's eyes. She wanted to scream, but she was so frightened that she could not make a sound. The creature broke the window glass, unlocked the window, and crawled inside. Margaret tried to flee, but the creature caught her. It twisted its long, bony fingers into her hair, pulled back her head, and sank its teeth into her throat. Margaret screamed and fainted. When her brothers heard her piercing scream, they rushed into her room. By the time they got to the door unlocked, the creature had fled. Margaret lay on the floor, bleeding and unconscious. While Paul tried to stop the bleeding, David chased the creature down the hill toward the graveyard, but soon he lost sight of it. The police thought it was the work of an escaped lunatic who believed he was a vampire. When Margaret recovered, her brothers wanted to move her to a safer place, where it would be harder to break in, but Margaret refused. The creature would never come back, she was sure of that. But just in case, Paul and David began to keep a loaded pistols in their rooms. One night, months later, Margaret was awakened by a scratching sound at the window. When she opened her eyes, there was the same shrunken face staring in at her. That night, her brothers heard her cries in time. They chased the creature down the hill. David shot it in the leg, but the creature managed to scramble over the graveyard wall and disappeared near an old burial vault. The next day, Margaret and her brothers watched as the sexton of the church opened and the burial vault. Inside was a horrifying scene. Broken coffins, bones, rotting flesh were scattered all over the floor. Only one coffin had not been disturbed. When the sexton opened it, there lay the creature with the shrunken face that had attacked Margaret. The telltale bullet was in its leg. They did the only thing they knew how to get rid of a vampire. The sexton built a roaring blaze outside the vault and fed the shrunken body to the flames. They watched the body burn until nothing remained but ashes. Wow, that's a good one. Vampires are not really what I'd think of, apart from they're so famous in horror. But, yeah, I've never read that one, so that's interesting. I like it. Margaret's a bad bitch. Margaret is a bad bitch. Shall we move on? This one is so short. This one is called The Voice. I thought I'd mix it up and let's just add in a really short one. Ellen had just fallen asleep when she heard a strange voice. Ellen, it whispered, I am coming up the stairs. I am on the first step. Now I am on the second step. Ellen got scared and called her parents, but they didn't hear her, and they didn't come. The voice then whispered, Ellen, I'm on the top step. Now I'm in the hall. Now I'm outside your room. Then it whispered, I'm standing right next to your bed. And then, I've got you. Ellen screamed and the voice stopped. Her father rushed into her room and turned on the light. Somebody's in here, Ellen said. They looked and looked. Nobody was there. That one is very short and absolutely terrifying. If I was lying in my bed just falling asleep to ASMR and just heard, I'm on the top step, I would be a vampire in a tomb. Let me tell you that for something. There's no way I would ever be the same kind of person ever again. Ever, ever, ever. That's it for me. I'm done. I'm done. Okay. What about Clinkity Clink? Clinkity Clink. Oh, Clinkity Clink. A long Clinkity Clink. Wow, okay. Clinkity Clink. An old lady got sick and died. She had no family and no close friends. So the neighbors got a grave digger to dig a grave for her, and they had a coffin made, and they placed it in her living room. As was the tradition, they washed her body and dressed her up in her best clothes and put her in the coffin. When she died, her eyes were wide open, staring at everything and seeing nothing. The neighbors found 2 silver dollars in her dresser. They put them on her eyelids to keep them closed. They lit candles and sat up with her so that they would not be too lonely on that first night that she was dead. The next morning the preacher came and said a prayer for her. Then everybody went home. Later the gravedigger arrived to take her to the cemetery and bury her. He stared at the silver dollars on her eyes and picked them up. How shiny and smooth they were. How thick and heavy. They're beautiful, he thought. Just beautiful. He looked at the dead woman with her eyes wide open. He felt as she was staring at him, watching him hold her coins. It gave him a creepy feeling. He put the coins back on her eyes to keep them closed. But before he knew, his hands reached out again and grabbed the coins and snuck them into his pocket. Then he grabbed a hammer and quickly nailed shut the lid on the coffin. Now you can't see anything, he said to her. cemetery. He then buried her as fast as he could. When the gravedigger got home, he put the 2 silver dollars in a tin box and shook it. The coins made a cheerful rattling sound, but the gravedigger wasn't feeling cheerful. He couldn't forget those eyes looking at him. When it got dark, a storm came up and the wind started blowing. It blew all around the house. It came through in cracks and around the windows and down the chimney. Bazoo! It went. Pissee, pissee, bazoo. The fire flared and flickered. The gravedigger threw some fresh wood on the fire and got into bed and pulled the blankets up to his chin. The wind kept blowing. Bazoo! It went. Pissee, pissee, bazoo. Then the fire flared and flickered, and the casting evil shadows onto the walls. The gravedigger lay there thinking about the dead woman's eyes staring at him. The wind blew stronger and louder, and the fire flared and flickered, and popped up and snapped. He got more and more scared. Suddenly he heard another sound. Clinkity clink, clinkity clink, it went. Clinkity clink, clinkity clink. It was the silver dollars rattling in the box. "Hey," he said, "who's taking my money?" But all he heard was the wind blowing. Pissee, pissee, pissoo. And the flames flaring and flickering, and snapping and popping, and the coins going clinkety clink, clinkety clink. He leapt out of bed and chained up the door. Then he hurried back, but his head could barely touch the pillow when he heard clinkety clink, clinkety clink. Then he heard something way off in the distance. It was like a voice crying, "Where is my money? Who's got my money? Who? And the wind blew, pissee, pissee, pissoo. And the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the money went clinkety clink, clinkety clink. The gravedigger was really scared. He got out of bed again and piled all the furniture against the door, put a heavy iron skillet over the tin box. Then he jumped back into bed and covered his head with the blankets. But the money rattled louder than ever, and way off, a voice cried, "Give me my money. Who's got my money? Who? And the wind blew, and the fire flare flickered, and snapped and popped, and the gravedigger shivered and shook and cried, "Oh, lordy, lordy." Suddenly, the front door flew open, and in walked the ghost of the dead woman, with her eyes wide open, staring at everything, seeing nothing. And the wind blew, pissee, pissee, pissoo, pissoo. And the money went clinkety clink, clinkety clink, and the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the ghost of the dead woman cried, "Oh, where is my money? Who's got my money? Oh, oh." And the gravedigger moaned, "Oh, lordy, lordy." The ghost could hear the money going clinkety clink, clinkety clink in the tin box. But her dead eyes couldn't see the box, so she reached out with her arms and tried to find it. The wind went pissee, pissee, pissoo, pissoo. The money rattled clinkety clink, clinkety clink, and the fire flared and flickered and snapped and popped, and the gravedigger shivered and shook and moaned, "Oh, lordy, lordy," and the woman cried, "Give me my money. Who's got my money? Oh, oh." You've got it. That was another. Now quickly jump at someone in the audience and scream, "You've got it." But I shall not scream at you, because I will tell you that I am complete. I am done. I'm finished reading those stories. I don't know about you, but I will sleep soundly and scaredly tonight. I hope you're staying safe. I hope you're doing well. I hope that I could have given you even a little bit of entertainment for Halloween. And I hope to see you was Whisperween.